Welcome back to History Holes, the lost empire of Champa. If you drive down the coast of central Vietnam today, past the white sand beaches and the modern resorts, you will occasionally see them. They stand on the hilltops like red skeletons, ancient towers built of brick burning orange in the sunset. They don't look Vietnamese, they don't look Chinese, they look like they belong in India. For most tourists, they are just a photo opportunity, a ruin to look at for 5 minutes before heading back to the hotel. But if you look closer, you will see something strange. The bricks are fused together without any mortar. No cement, no glue, just red clay, locked together so tightly that you can't slide a knife between them. These towers are the tombstones of a civilization that ruled this coast for 1,500 years. A civilization that was once a superpower of the South China Sea. They were the Vikings of Asia. They were master sailors who sacked the greatest city on earth. They worshipped Shiva the Destroyer, and they grew rich on spice and piracy. But today, their empire is gone. Their cities are dust, and their people are a minority in their own land. This is the story of the Kingdom of Champa, the Empire of Red Brick. Part 1. The Pirates of the East. To understand Champa, you have to forget everything you know about Vietnam. When we think of Vietnam, we usually think of the north, the Red River Delta, the rice paddies, the Confucian scholars, and the heavy influence of China. That is the story of the Dai Viet. They were a land power, focused on agriculture and bureaucracy. But Champa was the complete opposite. If you stood on the coast of Da Nang in the year 800 AD, you wouldn't see rice farmers. You would see ships. Thousands of them. The Cham people were not related to the Vietnamese in the north. They were Austronesian. Their cousins weren't in Beijing. They were in Hawaii, the Philippines, and Malaysia. They were children of the ocean. While the Dai Viet were building dikes to control the river, the Cham were building a maritime federation that controlled the trade routes of the world. They didn't have a single, unified capital like Hanoi. Instead, Champa was a Mandala State. It was a collection of powerful port cities, Indrapura, Vijaya, Kauthara. Each city was like a separate kingdom, ruled by its own Raja, but they all answered to a high king when it was time to go to war. And they were always at war. Because of their geography, Champa was squeezed. To the north, they had the aggressive, expanding Dai Viet. To the west, they had the massive Khmer Empire of Angkor. The only place they could go was east, into the ocean. So, they turned the sea into their territory. They became the gatekeepers of the spice route. If a merchant ship wanted to sail from India to China, they had to pass the coast of Champa. And the Cham made sure they paid for the privilege. They were merchants by day and pirates by night. Their navy was legendary. They developed swift, shallow-draft vessels that could strike a merchant convoy and disappear into the river estuaries before anyone could react. But they weren't just thugs. They were incredibly sophisticated. They imported their culture directly from India. While the North was memorizing the sayings of Confucius, the Cham were chanting the Vedas. They adopted Sanskrit. They wore silk dhotis. They worshipped the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and most importantly, Shiva. This created a massive cultural fault line right in the middle of modern-day Vietnam. On one side of the border, you had a civilization that looked to China, wrote in Chinese characters, and valued order and hierarchy. On the other side, you had a civilization that looked to India, wrote in Sanskrit, and valued charisma, trade, and naval power. For centuries, these two tigers circled each other. They traded, they married, and they fought. But the Cham had one advantage that terrified their neighbors. They had the ghost soldiers. According to the old chronicles, when the Cham went to war, they didn't just march, they danced. Their warriors were known for a trance-like fury, fueled by religious devotion to Shiva. They believed that death on the battlefield was a direct ticket to the heavens. This is the empire that the history books often forget. We talk about the Khmer Rouge, we talk about the Vietnam War, we talk about the dynasties of the North. But for 1,000 years, the powerhouse of the region wasn't Hanoi or Saigon. It was the Kingdom of Champa. And in the 12th century, they decided to prove it by doing the impossible. They decided to attack the biggest city in the world. Part 2, the Golden Mandala. While the Dai Viet in the north were digging dikes and planting rice, the Cham were doing something very different. They were getting rich. The kingdom of Champa was positioned on one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. Every merchant ship sailing from India to China, the two biggest economies in the ancient world, had to pass right by their front door. So the Cham kings made them an offer they couldn't refuse: pay us or sink. They built a navy of shallow draft raiding vessels that were fast, deadly, and perfect for the jagged coastline. If a merchant convoy tried to slip past without paying the protection tax, the Cham fleets would swarm them. But they weren't just pirates, they were traders. Their ports, cities like Indrapura and Vijaya, became the supermarkets of Asia. They sold ivory, rhinoceros horn, and the most expensive commodity of the medieval world, eaglewood. It was a rare, fragrant wood that the emperors of China burned in their palaces, and it grew deep in the Cham Mountains. This wealth created a society that looked nothing like Vietnam. Instead of a single rigid capital city, Champa was a Mandala State. Imagine a solar system. The king was the sun, but he didn't have absolute control over the planets. The local rajas in the port cities were powerful, independent, and wealthy. They paid tribute to the High King, but they ran their own shows. This flexibility made them hard to conquer. If you captured one city, the others would just close their gates and keep fighting. And holding this loose federation together was something stronger than laws. It was religion. The Cham didn't look to China for their gods. They looked to India. They were the easternmost outpost of the Hindu world. They adopted Sanskrit as their holy language. They wore silk dhotis instead of tunics. And most importantly, they worshipped Shiva. To the Cham, the king wasn't just a ruler. He was a Devaraja, a god king. They believed he was the living avatar of Shiva on earth. When he spoke, it was with the voice of the destroyer. This divine authority gave them a swagger that terrified their neighbors. They weren't just defending their land, they were defending the cosmic order. But wealth and confidence attract enemies. To the west, the Khmer Empire of Angkor was watching the Cham trade ships with envy. They wanted access to the sea, and they were building an army of war elephants to come and take it. The collision between the elephant army of the west and the pirate navy of the east was inevitable, and it would lead to one of the most audacious military strikes in history. Part 3. The City of Shiva. High in the mountains, hidden in a valley surrounded by jungle, lies the spiritual heart of Champa. It is called My Sun. For centuries, this was their Valley of Kings. It was here that the Cham rulers came to speak to their gods. The atmosphere in My Sun is heavy. It doesn't feel like the open, airy pagodas of the Vietnamese north. The temples here are dark, built of heavy red brick, with narrow interiors designed for fire rituals. The air would have been thick with incense smoke and the chanting of Sanskrit prayers. The god they worshipped here was Shiva. In Hinduism, Shiva is the destroyer. But to the Cham, he wasn't just a force of destruction. He was the source of royal power. The kings of Champa called themselves God Kings, Devaraja. They believed they were the earthly incarnations of Shiva himself. To prove it, they built massive lingams, phallic statues representing the creative power of the god, and bathed them in milk and gold. But the most mysterious thing about My Sun isn't the religion, it's the technology. Look closely at the walls. These bricks have stood in the tropical rain and baking sun for 1,000 years. Yet there is no mortar between them, no cement. You cannot slide a knife blade between the bricks. How did they do it? For decades, modern archaeologists were baffled. Some French scientists in the 1900s thought the Cham had built the towers out of wet clay and then fired the entire building like a giant kiln. Today, we know the truth is even stranger. The Cham had discovered a way to use a natural tree resin native to the jungle as a binding agent. They would grind the bricks perfectly flat, apply this resin, and fuse them together so tightly that they became a single solid mass. It was a secret technology that died with their empire. And inside these temples, the walls were covered with art that celebrated life. The most famous images are of the Apsaras, the celestial dancers. While the Dai Viet court in the north was rigid and modest, Cham culture celebrated the body. The Apsara carvings show women dancing with fluid, impossible curves wrapped in silks and jewelry. They represent a culture that was vibrant, sensual, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the universe. But this beauty was protected by something terrifying. The Cham knew they were surrounded by enemies, so they turned their religion into a weapon. They believed that Shiva gave them the power to destroy their foes. Before a battle, the priest would perform elaborate sacrifices to wake the god up, and in the year 1177, they would need him. The great enemy to the west, the Khmer Empire of Angkor, had pushed them too far. The Cham king decided it was time to stop defending and start attacking. He wasn't going to send an army over the mountains. He was going to do something no one had ever done before. He was going to sail his navy up a river, into the heart of the jungle, and burn the city of the gods to the ground. Part 4, The Clash of Tigers. The year is 1177. The location is the great Tonle Sap Lake, the beating heart of the Khmer Empire. For decades, the Khmer and the Cham had been locked in a death grip. The Khmer kings at Angkor were building the largest stone monuments the world had ever seen. They were powerful, rich, and convinced of their own invincibility. But the Cham king, Jaya Indravarman IV, was a military genius. He knew he couldn't beat the Khmer army on land. Their war elephants and heavy infantry were too strong. So he did something that no military commander in Southeast Asian history had ever attempted. He put his army on boats. It was a logistical nightmare. The Cham fleet had to sail from the coast of central Vietnam, around the southern tip of the Mekong Delta, and then navigate up the Mekong River against the current. They had to travel hundreds of miles inland, deep into enemy territory, rowing silently through the jungle. When they finally burst into the Tonle Sap Lake, the Khmer were completely unprepared. The bas-reliefs on the walls of the Bayon Temple in Cambodia still tell the story today. They show Cham warriors with their distinctive lotus flower hats, boarding the Khmer canoe barges. They show crocodiles waiting in the water for the falling bodies. The sack of Angkor was absolute. The Cham burned the wooden palaces. They looted the gold statues. They killed the king. For a brief moment, the pirates of the East were the masters of mainland Southeast Asia. But this victory was the beginning of the end. By destroying Angkor, the Cham woke up a sleeping giant. The Khmer regrouped under a new king, Jayavarman VII, and launched a counterattack that would devastate Champa. But the real threat wasn't coming from the west. It was coming from the north. The Dai Viet were growing. Their population was exploding in the Red River Delta. They needed land. They needed rice, and they looked south at the fertile plains of Champa with hungry eyes. The Cham had spent centuries raiding the Vietnamese coast, kidnapping villagers and burning temples. Now, the Vietnamese were coming to stay. This began the slow grinding process known as Nam Tiến, the march to the south. It wasn't a single war. It was a centuries-long strangulation. Sometimes it was violent. The Vietnamese armies would march south, annex a province, and build fortresses. But sometimes it was diplomatic. In one famous story, a Vietnamese king promised his daughter, the beautiful Princess Huyen Trun, to the Cham king in exchange for 2 provinces. The Cham king accepted. He got the girl. Vietnam got the land. It was a geopolitical masterstroke. Without firing a shot, the border moved south. The Cham were being squeezed to death. They were losing their ports, their rice fields, and their holy sites. The Empire of the Ocean was slowly becoming a landlocked refugee camp, and in the year 1471, the final blow would fall. The Vietnamese Emperor Le Tan Tong decided to finish the job once and for all. He raised a massive army, some say 200,000 men, and marched on the Champa capital of Vijaya. This wasn't a raid, it was an annihilation. Part 5, The Long March South. The destruction of the Champa capital at Vijaya in 1471 was not just a military defeat, it was a cultural extinction event. When the Vietnamese Emperor Le Tan Tong marched south, he didn't just want to win a battle. He wanted to erase a civilization. The historical records tell us that 60,000 Cham were killed and 30,000 were captured and taken north as slaves. But the most devastating blow was political. The emperor took the once mighty Champa Federation and shattered it. He carved the kingdom into tiny, powerless principalities. He installed puppet rulers who answered to Hanoi. This was the end of the Nam Tiến, the march to the south. For centuries, the Vietnamese people had been pushing down the coast like a slow-moving glacier. They needed land for their rice paddies, and the Cham were in the way. It wasn't always a war of soldiers. Often it was a war of farmers. Vietnamese settlers would move into Cham lands, clear the jungle, and build villages. Then, they would ask the Vietnamese court for protection. The border would shift south, mile by mile, village by village. Sometimes, the takeover was diplomatic. In the 1300s, a Vietnamese king had famously traded his own sister, Princess Huyen Tran, to the Cham king in exchange for provinces. The Cham king got a beautiful wife. The Vietnamese got the land that is now Hue and Da Nang. But by 1471, the diplomacy was over. The Cham people, who had once ruled the high seas, were now refugees in their own country. Their great ports were taken over by Vietnamese merchants. Their Hindu temples were abandoned to the jungle. The god kings who had channeled Shiva were replaced by Vietnamese mandarins who quoted Confucius. The surviving Cham began a long, tragic migration further south. Some fled to the mountains, others sailed to Cambodia. A large number converted to Islam, seeking a new identity and connection to the Malay world that had always been their distant cousins. The Empire of the Ocean had become a landlocked minority. And as the Vietnamese settlers moved into the conquered lands, they did something strange. They didn't destroy the Cham temples. They feared them. They believed the red brick towers were haunted by powerful spirits. So instead of tearing them down, the Vietnamese farmers would leave offerings of incense and fruit at the old shrines. They adopted the Cham goddess Po Nagar and renamed her Tien Ana, integrating her into their own folk religion. The Cham Empire was gone, but its ghosts were still watching from the hills. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the map of Vietnam began to look like the S shape we know today. The Vietnamese had reached the Mekong Delta. They had swallowed Champa whole. But the story of Champa isn't just about defeat. It's about resilience. Because despite the massacres, the slavery, and the assimilation, the Cham are still here. Today, there are still Cham communities in central Vietnam and the Mekong Delta. They still weave their distinctive textiles. They still play their drums. And once a year, they still climb the red brick towers to honor the spirits of their ancestors. History is usually written by the victors. The Vietnamese won the land. But if you listen closely to the wind blowing through the ruins of my son, you can still hear the echo of the lost empire. You can hear the sound of the ocean and the drums of Shiva, beating for a kingdom that refused to die quietly. I thank you very much for sticking around for this episode. Please subscribe, and if you have any ideas of what we should explore next, drop a comment. Till next time.